So stop me if you've heard this one before. Your party enters a room and faces down a group of orcs. Then you spend the next hour and a half trading hit points. Combat goes something like this. Alright, it's my turn again. I roll to hit the orcs, and then I roll a 12. That's not enough to hit. Okay. Alright, it's my turn. I roll to hit the orcs, and I roll... Yes, I roll 16. Alright. Roll damage. Okay. But Dungeon Master Lee is here to tell you that it doesn't always have to be like that. At its best, Dungeons & Dragons can be one of the most fun, exciting, and kinetic strategy games out there. It can present so many different opportunities for your players to engage with their characters and the situation at hand. So, how do you fix the issue? How do you keep combat tense, exciting, and fast-paced? In this episode of Dungeon Master U, I, Dungeon Master Lee, want to help you present your players with the encounters that you see in your mind, keeping them exciting and tense and action-packed as you know they can be. Join me, won't you, in this episode of Dungeon Master U, where you are the Dungeon Master. So, first things first, let's break down a typical Dungeons & Dragons encounter. And we're talking no frills, no excitement, just one-to-one characters to NPC combat. We'll go straight out of the box. We have a player party of 4 people, and we'll have an approximately equal number of bad guys. Let's just say orcs. Those are easy. So, what happens in combat is you roll initiative to see who goes when in the action order, then, depending on that, each player will decide their overall strategy. And then, turn by turn, each side will try to run the other out of hit points. Once one side has run out of the bank of hit point total, then the other side, the one that still has hit points remaining, is declared the victor. This combat might look something like this. You have your line of orcs, and you have your line of player characters. The orcs will move forward, depending on who goes first, and the player characters will move to engage them, or vice versa. This creates a static line of engagement where the player characters and the orcs are stuck. Nobody wants to escape this line of engagement because if they do, they risk provoking attacks of opportunity, which in turn means that one side might have the advantage over the other. In other words, one side has more opportunities to run the other out of hit points. So what you get is a bunch of people in one static line for the duration of the engagement. You force rolls against one another and make sure that you suffer less than your opponents. So how can we mix this up? What can we change in the setup or in the turn-to-turn action to keep things interesting and make sure that it doesn't just devolve into swapping hit points? Let's take our basic Dungeons & Dragons combat piece by piece. The first thing I want to look at in the basic Dungeons & Dragons combat is the objective. And I want to frame this by asking a very simple question. How do the players win? Typically, when you're running a Dungeons & Dragons encounter, it's kind of tacitly understood that combat ends when one side or the other completely runs out of hit points. Now, this is sort of an unchallenged assumption in a lot of Dungeons & Dragons combat. Combat ends with a TPK on one side or the other. This makes sense a lot when you're crawling through a dungeon and you run across a Grick and it attacks you because you're cornering it and it has no other options. You're here to kill it and its goal is survival. But really, that only covers a certain amount of Dungeons & Dragons encounters. So my question to you is this. When is reducing the enemy team to 0 hit points not really enough? To go further, what are other win conditions that don't involve enemy hit points at all? When I'm coming up with combat for my games, I like to draw inspiration from other sources, like video games and board games, and other sort of interactive media that you can draw objectives from. So, for example, one of my favorite video games is Resident Evil 4. One of the central parts of that game is you are a Secret Service agent trying to defend the president's daughter. No, I know you're not excited about the idea of defending a VIP, but think about it for a second. What if there was a non-player character that your characters had to defend above all others? This non-player character has an objective that they are trying to accomplish that none of the player characters can. Say, they're trying to complete a ritual, or they're trying to check a different set of mechanisms because they're the only one that knows how they work. Meanwhile, enemies are trying to attack that particular person. Not the player characters, that particular person. So all of the goblins are directing all of their focus on this NPC. Suddenly, the player characters are trying to figure out how best to put themselves between the enemies and this non-player character. The objectives have completely changed. You're not trying to reduce the enemy team to 0 hit points, you're trying to keep your very important person from dying themselves. This presents a whole bunch of different choices for your players to try and engage with. For example, I have the best damage output, but I'm reduced to about 10 to 15 hit points. One solid hit could kill me, so should I go out in a blaze of glory and try and attack the most damaging character on the opponent's team? Or should I hang back next to the NPC and try and make sure that whatever gets close to them dies in one hit? Or, as a cleric, maybe I only have a certain amount of healing left. Do I keep my team optimally healed, or do I make sure that the very important person is healed instead? Now, keeping a very important person alive, as we all know from playing video games, kinda sucks. It's very frustrating, especially when the programming of that character makes them kind of frustrating. They put themselves in harm's way, and they don't make smart choices, and as a result, it feels more like babysitting than it does escorting. This is where, in an RPG, you as the Dungeon Master can make sure to sidestep those problems. Your VIP can act like a smart, rational person. They can react with your brains and your thoughts and your strategy. They can do what the player characters tell them to do because the player characters are talking to you. Likewise, they don't have to be a squishy, vulnerable nobody. They can be on par with the other player characters. In fact, one of my favorite encounters with an NPC that was similar in this way was an NPC who was designed to give the characters buffs. The very important person was nothing but a supplier of buffs. While they were going around trying to fix whatever it was they were trying to fix, they were supplying the party with mage armor and heals and damage bonuses. This allowed encounters to be built slightly higher than they would have otherwise to make them feel more intense and more invigorating. More challenging. That's the word I was looking for. So, okay, escort mission. That's one example of a way to mix up win criteria. But what about the other direction? What if there was one very important person on the enemy's team that the players had to fight? If that person dies, then the combat is basically over. So, say there's an evil wizard trying to complete a ritual. That's a pretty stereotypical setup, but it works pretty well. So, you have the player character's party, and you have all the NPC mooks trying to run interference defending the priority target. Now, this provides a bunch of other player choices that make combat interesting as well. Do the players engage with the mooks, or do they try to decide what will do the most damage to the priority target? Will one character try to run interference and draw attention away from the other characters who can, in fact, target the bad wizard? Or do the player characters try to run forward as fast as they can in an uncoordinated melee and take out as many people as they can as quickly as possible? The list of potential scenarios goes on and on and on. The list is basically limited to what you, as a dungeon master, can think up to try and prevent player characters from just focusing on how best to slaughter the enemy team. So we have hold a position, defend a caravan. We have try and secure an artifact from the enemy team. You know, the enemy team is going to try and run up and steal the football. Your player characters can run and try and steal that football back and defend it from anybody trying to take it. This gives you a nice back and forth of kinetic movement. You know, if you get the football to your end zone, then you win, and if the enemy team gets the football to their end zone, then you lose. So again, this doesn't have to be in the context of the story of your game. This just has to be a mechanical thought of when combat ends. What makes a fight over? Obviously, if the enemy team is reduced to 0 hit points, the fight is going to be finished. But if that is off the table, then what means that the fight is over? How do the players win? What are they trying to do with their abilities? I would say try and take wholesale slaughter off the table. As a bonus question, I would encourage you, as a dungeon master, to ask yourselves, when will the enemy team stop fighting? Are they going to throw themselves wholesale at the meat grinder that is the enemy party? Or is there a point when they will decide that enough is enough and they will retreat? This has the double benefit of making sure that combat doesn't run on too unnecessarily long, and making the enemies you set against your player characters feel more like people. I mean, honestly, a lot of times outside of a game, how often do people just force themselves against a meat grinder until they're dead? So, how do you figure out that combat is over? How do you figure out who won? And at which point does one side decide to give up? These are all things that can help you keep combat fresh, and keep each combat from trying to accomplish the same exact thing as the combat before it. So the next thing that I want to ask about the basic Dungeons and Dragons combat is, where does the fighting take place? And again, this isn't necessarily about the context of the fight. The fighting can take place wherever you need the fighting to take place. Rather, I want to ask about the arena. What is on the table where your fighting is taking place? Does it take place in just a blank field? Does it take place in a field that is separated by a raging river? Those are two very different types of fights. So what makes an interesting arena? What can you, as the Dungeon Master, introduce into the combat, by which I mean the board of the game, to make sure the players have something to do? First things first, I would encourage you to think about obstacles. In our example, for example, we had the wide open field, but that field was cut down the middle by a raging river. This gives the players another chance to think around the problem ahead of them. It gives them a complication to try and overcome in their quest to reduce the enemy team to 0 hit points. I mean, if the enemy team is composed of nothing but archers, then getting across that river is a real big priority. Or the players can choose to prioritize their ranged abilities over, say, their melee attacks. Trying to emphasize different strengths or weaknesses in order to overcome the problem. The other side of that coin is to introduce things that are beneficial to the players, or, beneficial to whoever uses them, like cover, or different hazards, different course layouts that you can put on the playing field that your players might choose to use over just standing in the open. So on our basic open playing field, maybe introduce a couple of trees or rocks that the players can hide behind. They can pop out to shoot the enemy and maybe hide behind them to obscure sightlines, which in turn means that you, as a Dungeon Master, have to think through how to best attack your players. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is make your players choose different things. Put things on the board to make them choose to interact with them. Maybe they choose to engage with this beneficial thing, or choose how best to overcome this thing that can harm them, or provide an obstacle. So another question is, how can your players use the environment? Or how can your players choose to overcome it? So there are a couple of ways to think about board layout. One is the paintball arena theory. In this way of laying out your combat board, you have a fair amount of mechanical fairness just baked into the layout itself. You have equal amounts of cover on both sides, or equal access to the type of cover that can benefit each side of the playing field. And again, you don't have to have an in-game context for them yet. You can just lay out different boards that you can use to make combat more interesting. Things that your player characters can choose to use or choose to avoid. But what about all of the things that you, as a child in the real world, didn't have access to in the paintball arena? Since this is an RPG, you have the opportunity, as a Dungeon Master, to introduce a whole bunch of really fun, really silly things that you wouldn't introduce otherwise. So, recently I watched The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser, from, I think, 1999. One of the best action movies of the 90s. But I was watching it and thinking, how would I run this as a Dungeon Master? It's a great seminal adventure movie, and it is a cast of party characters going up against a rival team of adventurers and a big bad evil guy trying to secure the gold and escape. As you watch it, you notice that there are all these awesome action set pieces that honestly would run really fun in a Dungeons and Dragons combat. One of the most memorable wasn't even a combat at all. It was the librarian Evie trying to replace a book, I think, on a shelf, or reach for a book that was too far out of her reach, and she ends up knocking down every single bookshelf in the library in sort of a domino effect. And though that wouldn't necessarily play as a Dungeons and Dragons combat, it, and moments like it in The Mummy, can provide a lot of fun, slapstick, adventure moments for your player characters to interact with. Other great examples of adventure movies I watched recently were Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The combat on top of the moving tank heading towards a cliff is just such a fun concept. I mean, imagine playing that as a Dungeons and Dragons encounter. The tank moves a certain number of squares per round, headed towards a horrible death. There is a hard time limit in which the player characters can fight. And likewise, there's a moving kinetic object that the player characters have to figure their way around. So if they go on the treads, they're kind of zoomed backwards, you know? And if they're kicked off the moving vehicle, then they have to find a way to get back on. Or at least hang on until they can figure out a way to climb back on top of the safe area. Having these props and these platforms and these set pieces for your player characters to interact with can be an excellent way to keep encounters feeling fresh and new. This way, even though they're trying to reduce the enemy to 0 hit points, they have to figure out their way around a bunch of other constraints to do so. I call these swashbuckling features. These are the chandeliers that you can swing on while you're buckling a swash, to try and get to the bad guy who's holding the prince or princess hostage. For inspiration, look at things like Pirates of the Caribbean, or The Mummy, or any of the Indiana Jones movies. And if you want to go really deep into this, you can go as far back as Errol Flynn doing pirate movies, or Buster Keaton doing slapstick comedy. All of these share a very similar action DNA, which honestly translates very easily into your Dungeons and Dragons encounters. So, what are the elements you're introducing into the playing field that the players have to figure their way around? Some things that can help their situation, and some things that can hinder them, that they have to figure out how to overcome. What are things that the enemies can also take advantage of that the players don't want them to? And this can be as basic as cover, or a hazard that the enemies have positioned themselves behind. And for bonus points, what are the kinetic elements that you can introduce to your arena to make them fun? These are the ropes that your player characters can swing on. These are the chandeliers that they can ride to rescue the princess. These are the hazards that they can take advantage of. For example, what if the enemy kobolds are sitting underneath a chandelier? And surprise, surprise, the player characters are standing right next to the rope holding it to the ground. Things that can move, things that can increase mobility, or things that the player characters can choose to take advantage of. All of these are great opportunities to introduce variety into your encounters. Remember, Dungeons and Dragons is an adventure game. Give your players opportunities to buckle a swash. Give them opportunities to think around the enemy team and figure out the best way to take advantage of the situation you've presented to them. It doesn't have to be balanced. It doesn't have to be laid out like a paintball arena or a laser tag fun zone. It just has to give your player characters a chance to take advantage of or think around a problem. Alright, okay, so we have the win condition. What your characters are trying to accomplish in order to make the combat finish. In the basic Dungeons & Dragons, this is reducing your enemy team to 0 hit points. I encourage you to think outside of that particular box. Likewise, you're trying to introduce things into your arena where your players are going to have to make a choice, whether to take advantage of something or to try and overcome something. The next question that I would encourage you to think about and answer for yourself is, who are your players fighting? And again, in the context of your game world, this can have any number of answers. It can be bugbears trying to steal your player's gold. It can be an evil wizard trying to resurrect their lost loved one. But in the mechanics, what are they fighting? What are the abilities of the enemy team? And in terms of ability, what are their strengths and weaknesses? Are they particularly good at ranged? Are they weak against melee? I'm doing this thing on Twitter, actually, called Monday Night Monster Fight. I encourage you to check it out if you happen to see this. It's every Monday at 5:30 Mountain Standard Time, but I go through the monster manual and pit one monster against another monster. This has been an excellent way for me to grow as a dungeon master, because what it's forcing me to do is figure out what each monster is good at and what each monster is bad at. And when you face the monsters against each other, how do they measure up? Thinking through the composition of the enemy team in a particular encounter can really force your players to adapt and think and make choices. Some monsters, like goblins, can do basically well in any role they're given. They have a short sword, they have a short bow, and they have only so many hit points. Functionally, they can fit any slot you need them to. Other monsters, like, say, earth elementals, are very good tanks, and they're surprisingly good at getting behind enemy lines because they can travel through unworked earth as if they were swimming. The problem with earth elementals is that at challenge rating 5, they just don't have that many magical abilities to contend with the stronger abilities of your player characters. A team of earth elementals might do very well against a team of player characters that is composed entirely of fighters. The fighters just don't have that much to contend with the earth elementals' ability to get behind enemy lines and to deal with just people hitting them with swords. But a team of wizards might do really, really well against earth elementals. Earth elementals, if I'm remembering correctly, just don't have the ability to contend with ranged attacks or with magical abilities. That's all a very runaround way of saying that different monsters have different things that they ask of player characters, and will be strong against different classes and abilities. So here's kind of an off-topic question. How many of you have played the original Doom? The reason I bring this up is one of the biggest strengths of Doom as a video game was that it only had a couple of enemy types, but it made a bunch of really interesting combinations of them. For example, there were the imps that shot fireballs that were pretty weak. There were the cyber demons, I think they were called, that had chain guns and they were very strong. That sort of thing. Each of these encounters only consisted of 3 or 4 basic types of enemies, but they mixed them up in such a way that they had the player think through the problem in a number of different ways. So the way that you would approach an empty room full of cyber demons is much different than approaching an empty room full of imps. And if the empty room had a cyber demon and 3 imps, you would have to think through it much differently than you would in either of the other given situations. The same thing is going to hold true for your encounters. A CR5 encounter of an earth elemental is going to be very difficult for some parties, and very easy for others. And no matter what the player character party is made of, an earth elemental is going to force them to think through the problem in their own particular way. So here's a basic encounter for our basic Dungeons & Dragons combat that makes things kind of more interesting. So say on plain empty field, the player characters are facing off against 3 melee fighters, 2 ranged fighters, and 1 wizard. How do you think through that? By mixing up the different enemy types in an encounter, your player characters are going to have to react to a different type of situation. This gives your players a chance to use all of their abilities, and use them in creative ways. Likewise, one thing that you as a Dungeon Master can mix up is enemy tactics. Enemy teams are going to try and react to their enemies. Their enemies, in this case, are the player characters. Having the enemy, I've confused myself, having the NPCs run to the player characters, there we go, is a lot different when you consider the tactics of this situation. If all of your monsters just run forward and force themselves into the meat grinder of the player characters, then the combat's going to turn out the same in every case. It's going to end in a line of engagement where nothing much happens and nobody moves. Instead, as a Dungeon Master, I would encourage you to think through what your monsters are trying to accomplish on the board. You can get really mean with it by trying to target individual player characters, or you can just have it be a general sort of tactic programming, like they're going to try and avoid melee engagement at all costs. You can get as complicated or as simplistic as you want with the tactics, but having tactics for your monsters is a great way to keep combat moving. Play to the strengths and weaknesses of the monsters in your combat encounter. And this information is already given to you in the monster manual. A Grick, for example, is going to fight a lot differently than a bronze dragon. Goblins or kobolds, when faced with a stronger foe, will probably try to be tricky. They won't want to engage one-on-one, toe-to-toe, because they know they'll lose. And, if we're being honest, goblins are cowards. There's one, if you're new to Dungeons & Dragons, I would encourage you to look up the story of Tucker's Kobolds. It's just one of those old-timey memes that was floating around about how people played Dungeons & Dragons back in the day. How old Dungeon Masters, who were not necessarily on the side of their players, would use low-level monsters to try and make their players' lives miserable. And it all comes down to the tactics these monsters would use. So, to sum it all up, think about the monsters that make up your encounters. Think about their strengths and weaknesses, and how best to employ them. Or I guess, not how best, but how interestingly. how you would play the character of these monsters. And likewise, think about the tactics or the AI programming of the NPCs that you're employing. The last question I want to talk about in the basic Dungeons and Dragons combat is, what's at stake? What do the characters stand to lose? And I mean, I know the players will die. That's kind of obvious. Like, TPK, that is thrown out there as the worst outcome in a Dungeons and Dragons combat. But I am here to tell you, as one dungeon master to another, that that is not the worst thing that can happen to your players. In a tabletop RPG, death is a pretty good motivator. But as a motivation goes, it's pretty cut and dry. In a tabletop game, death lacks a certain emotional punch. So if I die, it sucks and I have to reroll a character, but ultimately, it's not that big of a deal. But if something or someone dies because I couldn't stop it, that's an entirely different matter. So a question I would encourage you as a dungeon master to ask yourself of any encounter you put out there is, what happens if my players lose? What is the greater thing at stake than my player characters' lives? Are the player characters all that stand between the evil warlord's army and a defenseless village? Is the enemy going to steal a priceless treasure that they could do horrible things with? If the player characters don't defeat the enemies here, are the enemies literally going to eat a child? One tool you can use, one question you can ask about the encounter that you're building, is what are the consequences of losing? What are the stakes? Think about what's important to the player characters, what they seem to have attached to. This can be something from their backstory. This can be something that you've built out in your world. But regardless, whatever it happens to be, it should be something that the player characters are willing to die for. So one thing that you can do to try and mix up the basic Dungeons and Dragons combat encounter is ask yourself what your players would rather die than do, or let happen. And then, of course, because you're a dungeon master, put that on the line. And again, this is a tool. This is a question you can ask of the situation, and something you can apply to the encounter to make it more meaningful and make it stand out from all the other encounters that you're going to have. I would recommend maybe using this a little more sparingly than the other elements that I have presented to you thus far. Like jalapeno peppers, if you put too much of them in a dish, this will cause it to become a little unpalatable. But if you put just the right amount, it will make it delicious. So, we're reaching the end of the episode, and at the end of the episode, I like to kind of go over all of the things that I have talked about thus far, and kind of go over the broader goal, and kind of summarize everything. So what do we have? We have trying to mix up the win conditions of the match. Not the in-story objectives, but the conditions by which your players can achieve victory. Second, we have making your arenas interesting. Asking yourself where the fight takes place, and thinking mechanically what you can introduce on your game board to give your players interesting choices to make. You can further complicate this and make this more interesting by introducing moments where your players can buckle a swash. Next up, we have the enemy team composition. Who are the enemies? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And as a result, what will they choose to do in facing off against the player character party? And lastly, think about what the stakes are for the encounter. What's on the line? What do the players stand to lose or gain? So those are all the tools. The objective that I am trying to encourage you to pursue is to try and keep each encounter from feeling like the one before it. You can have so much fun as a dungeon master mixing up combat in Dungeons and Dragons. So I guess the most important question in this entire episode is, what are my players getting out of this? And not just in the context of the game, not just gold pieces or experience points. I mean, what is fun about this encounter? Dungeons and Dragons as a tabletop strategy game has so much opportunity for fun, engaged strategy. It can be so meaty and chewy and tactical. You can make so many fun and engaging decisions, both as a player character and as a dungeon master. If you're not careful, it can end up as just a line of Little League scrimmage, where you're swapping hit points until one side runs out. But as a dungeon master, you have the ability to make it so much more than that. All you have to do is start asking yourself questions. That's been the episode. I hope you enjoyed. I learned a lot doing this episode, and I hope you did too. It's always fun to take a look at what you're doing as a dungeon master and see if you can really describe it, and see if you can ask yourself questions about your technique. If you have any questions, or if you think of another way to make encounters exciting and engaging, please feel free to leave a comment below, or get in touch with me on Twitter. You'll find a link to that in a description somewhere on something. I'm not entirely sure. It's up to you to find it. Bye! The last thing I want to talk about in this episode... I think I still have water dribbling down my chin? The last thing I want to talk about... So I have a lisp. I've had a lisp for, like, most of my life. Gather round, children. Or story time. One of the things that really bums me out about my lisp is that sometimes I just drool when I'm talking, and it's really embarrassing. That's me! Welcome! Hi, I'm DM Lee.